The river water lapped against the hull. The Yanase was about 100 miles wide near Lukshai, and it felt like an ocean. Luke was a deckhand on the Emerald Blade. Working for the Dragon-Blooded was strange. As Luke aged, the young man he met 25 years ago still looked the same. General Josem Vanadu had climbed the ranks of the 7th Legion with expert precision. He pulled Luke along with him and treated him like a son. Luke could never take on a major role in the Navy because he was immortal. He was allowed to train and fight along with the soldiers on the ship for years. He learned many things and even outfought young Dragon-Blooded. Luke had a family that disagreed with his choice to join the Navy, but they supported him nonetheless. The general eventually brought in another young man to work at his side, Iselsi Enuma Sira. Luke and Enuma became close friends. They looked out for each other when they transferred ships with the general. They fought back-to-back through many campaigns. Several years passed and they found themselves standing on the deck of the Emerald Blade again as it stood in a blockade against the Imperial ships. Luke had heard that the Imperial Navy was looking to collect the new taxes that the Scarlet Throne had suddenly levied. The general was told not to allow any Imperial ships to land. The Imperial ships were loaded with troops that would take what was not freely given. The standoff was in its 15th day when the Dragon-Blooded assassination team boarded the Emerald Blade. Luke was walking on deck when the group slipped over the side. Luke tried to run to the alarm bell but was stopped by a water-aspected dragon. He caught him with a water whip around his neck. Luke grabbed onto it and struggled as he slipped to the ground. The water whip would not give, and Luke began to panic as he ran out of breath. The stars seemed to fade away when suddenly an explosion of saffron essence radiated from Luke's body. A story-tall figure of a god-king warrior stood over the ship. The water dragon covered his eyes and his essence whip disappeared. A booming voice tore through Luke's mind.
You are chosen by me, the unconquered sun, to be my ascending sun, child of the dawn, lightbringer, bronze tiger, to be my sword of heaven. Victory is life.
Across the water, the commander of the Imperial forces sees the essence flare as it illuminates the entire river and the forces of the enemy. "Commander, engage the blockade," the Imperial general commanded. The ships leapt to life and began to close the distance between the two sides. Luke opened his eyes and was stunned that it was almost as bright as day. The water dragon slowly stood. He was holding one arm up to shield his eyes from the overwhelming essence display, while the other arm reached to form another whip out of water. Luke knew that he had to strike first, or the Dragon-Blooded would be able to channel his essence to enhance his abilities. As soon as he thought about charging his opponent, he was standing next to him. The Dragon-Blooded looked up to find his target was gone. Luke pulled his arm back and told himself to hit as hard as he could. Essence answered, as his hands hardened into an iron-like density as the blow landed. Teeth flew out of the dragon's mouth and blood splashed everywhere as he staggered backwards. Luke could feel his ability to fight double in skill as the flood of memories came back to him. He again exploded with speed and stopped next to the hurt dragon. He quickly and expertly grappled the dragon and then slammed him into the deck of the ship. The boards cracked and splintered under them. The dragon lost consciousness. Below deck, another Dragon-Blooded, fire-aspected, ignited the first-age flame ammunition that was kept in the hold of the Emerald Blade. The ship exploded in a giant ball of flame. It was 3 days before the Lukshai Navy found the makeshift raft and the 3 people on board. Luke had fished General Vanadum and Enuma from the river. Both were in bad shape but alive and grateful. Upon returning to Lukshai, the general gave Luke an auriculum power bowl and an auriculum smash fist from the vaults of the Lukshai manse. "Luke, you have to leave. I cannot protect you, but I can help you if you need something. Just send a raven and we'll see what I can do," Vanatu said. Luke could sense the emotion filling the room. Both were too proud to give in to it. Luke bowed one last time to his good friend. He then turned and left the room. The corridor was dark and quiet at this time of night. A figure stood in the shadows. It wasn't concealed very well. "Enuma, you are terrible at hiding," Luke said.
"That's a lot coming from you, Forsaken. So you thought you could just sneak away into the dark?"
Enuma smirked. "I knew you couldn't handle it, so I was trying to spare you," Luke said.
"I'm going to miss you, brother. Stay safe,"
Enuma said. "I will miss you too. Keep the old man out of trouble." "I don't want to have to come back and rescue you both again," Luke snorted. Enuma stepped forward, and the two hugged.
"If you need anything, let me know. I will try to keep the hunt off your trail for as long as I can,"
Enuma said. "Be careful yourself, brother. The Immaculates don't look too kindly on those who help us abominations," Luke said as they parted. Enuma stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Luke walked towards the outside. He picked up his pace as he exited the house he had called home for over half of his life. The sound of the hammer striking an anvil rang out through the air of the small village of Jekko on a cool spring morning. A woman and a small child walked through the dirt streets toward the blacksmith's shop. Several townsfolk waved at Ophel and Elet as they passed them. The townsfolk thought highly of her husband Stelios. He had defended the townsfolk from all sort of threat in the last few years since they moved to the small village on the edge of the wild. Beasts, fae, and wild corrupted bandits were all thwarted by his warhammer and his tactical skill. She eventually stepped into the shop that was passed down to Stelios from his father. The heat met her sharply. She smiled as she saw the large man standing over the forge, hammer in hand, with his violet eyes watching the metal take shape. As her shadow passed over the forge, he looked up and smiled at his wife and child. "Did someone bring Daddy some lunch?" he asked. "You're always hungry," she said as she set down the basket with a cloth covering his lunch except for the long end of bread sticking out. "Lush," Elet said, and she pointed to the basket that was set down on the table. Stelios put down his hammer and walked over to the bucket of water and thrust his hands in it. He splashed water over his face and chest to cool off. He raised up and pulled down a small cloth that was hanging on a beam and toweled off. He turned and stepped over to his family and kissed them both. One hand on his wife's shoulder and the other hand reached out to the basket and pulled out a roasted bird leg. He leaned back and took a hearty bite out of it. "You treat me good," he said, and they both laughed. An older man entered the shop with a worried look on his face. "Stelios, we have a problem. A scout just returned with a warning of bandits and wild-shaped beasts are heading this way. They will be here in less than an hour," Anir said in a shaky voice. "Gather all the warriors. We will set out right away," Stelios commanded as he spun and grabbed his warhammer. He turned to his family. "Go home and get in the cellar. I'll be back soon." She and the child turned and quickly ran out of the shop. The townsfolk battled for several days. Short bursts of the enemy would be joined, and they would be dispatched. Eventually the enemy was broken, but it came at a heavy cost. Several hundred went into battle, and only 20 of them began to walk back to Jekko. When they crested the last hill, they saw the smoke rising from their village. The raggedy group began to run home. Smoldering ruins were all that remained. They searched for survivors, but only a few lived. In the center of the village stood the well and a name scrawled on it in blood, Gambakim. Stelios never found his wife or child. The house was destroyed and the cellar was broken in. There was blood on the stone steps showing that a body was drug out and disappeared as it reached the edge of the woods. Several years passed and the broken Stelios just worked the forge and went home and slept. His world was gone. Day in and day out was the same. The hammer and the forge rang out through the village. Stelios had put his fighting days behind him. He no longer remembered the days of him traveling around as a hammer for hire, moving from village to village, only settling down when he met the innkeeper's daughter, Ophel. One day he began to notice that his tools would be moved from where he had set them down. Orders would be found in strange places. Finally, Stelios decided to set a barrel trap to catch the wild creature that had been messing with him. The next morning he discovered a teenage boy from the surrounding farmlands. He remembered seeing him come in with his father, who was looking for a new plow. The young man smiled at Stelios and chuckled under his breath. "Hello, old man." Stelios said as he picked up the barrel, walked out into the street, and tossed the boy and the barrel to the ground. The boy bounced out of the barrel as it broke apart. "Don't ever come back," Stelios warned. For the next several months, the boy would return and prank Stelios. Eventually, they would reach the end of Stelios' patience. Then one day, Stelios noticed that the boy stopped coming. Several weeks passed when the boy appeared in his doorway, bloody and in shock. Diogenes dreamed as he lay on the makeshift cot Stelios had in the back of his shop. He dreamed of his funny jokester father Danon tilling the earth on the small farm outside of Jelko. Therese, his mother, watched from the porch mending clothes while a stew slowly cooked inside. Then the dream moved to meeting the old man who worked in the village, the man who defended the attack on the town, the man who lost his wife and child, the man who never smiled, the man with sad eyes, Stelios. He dreamed of working hard to pull pranks on him. He ran even faster when he stoked the anger of the big man. He saw the moments when the old man's empty eyes looked off into the distance. The dream took a turn as a large, blood-covered ape entered their house and killed his mom and dad. He ran out back while the ape lifted his father over his head and pulled him in two. He ran into the woods and didn't stop until he collapsed in the early morning. The people of Jericho stared as Dio walked the street. They wore masks of terror as he passed them. He woke to Stelios sitting over him, wiping his face with a cold cloth. "We shall watch out for each other now," Stelios said. After returning from Dio's wrecked home, Stelios declared to the village that he would take the boy in and train him to be a protector. Over the next few months, he saw the boy's desire for revenge, so he taught him everything he knew about fighting. Dios understood that Stelios had set down his weapon to honor his family, and that he only was picking it up again in order to train him. Master and apprentice? Father and son? Brothers? Stelios sent Dio on a small mission out to the border marches. Dio had been out there for weeks when he came upon the trail of destruction. At the end of the trail was a large, bloody ape eating off the corpse of a woodland animal. Dio hid until the light faded from the sky and the breeze ran through the field of crystalline flowers. They made an eerie sound. Dio's blood burned as he watched the demon talk to himself.
Come back and prefer the taste of human flesh. Come back and needs to find another dwelling, where he can take them by surprise. Eat the older ones first, and the young ones last. Young ones are the sweetest. Come back and likes to eat the sweet things last.
Dio picked up a stone and threw it to cause a distraction. The ape stopped eating and slowly turned to the sound of several crystalline flowers breaking. It froze. Dio sprinted toward the creature. He leapt up into the air and wrapped his legs around the demon's neck. His blade came down as the ape looked up with its open mouth. The blade slid down its throat and severed its spine. Suddenly a surge of power rushed through his core. Swirling shadows surrounded him. A deep, encompassing darkness seemed to emanate from within him. Images of nocturnal creatures and denizens of the night flashed through his mind, and he was brought to his knees in a cold sweat. Dio took the head to prove that he took revenge on the demon that killed his family. He walked back to Stelios without stopping. Everything passed in a daze. One night as Stelios was closing up shop, the young man staggered through the door. He was covered in blood, and he collapsed and dropped something that he had been carrying. It rolled to Stelios' feet, and the wrapping opened up. The face of the demon ape stared lifelessly at him. "Come back, the boy said as he closed his eyes. The boy Dio told Stelios of what had happened to him, how the Earmanthoi demon, Gambak, had attacked his family farm as he was forced to run for his life. Over the next few days, Dio was too exhausted to do much, so Stelios set him up at the storefront and left him to go mine ore in order to fill some of his orders. He explained he would be gone a few days and that Dio should rest and mind the store until he returned. On his third day in the mine, Stelios broke through a wall and found himself in a manse that heavily resembled a workshop. A thick layer of dust covered everything. Not wanting to tarry, Stelios turned to leave, but he heard a soft voice calling to him from behind. "Welcome home, descending sun, child of twilight," it said. Gripping his pickaxe, Stelios slowly turned. The dais in the center of the chamber had a stone embedded in it, and the stone was beginning to glow a pale green. Stelios began to approach. Behind the dais he found a giant hammer. Again he heard the voice call his name, and the stone's glow increased. "Stelios, solar lightning, copper spider, take your gift," it said. Stelios reached for it, and was uncertain if he drew it from its perch or if it leapt into his hand. Either way, it was in his possession now. That is when the other voice spoke.
"So this is where you have been hiding, Thebum. I knew you would return to one of your old haunts."
Stelios turned to see a figure wrapped head to toe in bandages, wearing a tattered black cloak. The cloak was clasped by a pin of a broken mask. Across the figure's back was a large, twisted sword of what looked like a cross between smoke and obsidian. Soul steel.
"I thought when you received my invitation those years ago you would have come to find your old partner,"
the man wheezed. "Who are you? I have no partner," Stelios barked back.
"Oh, don't tell me after a few short centuries you've forgotten me,"
it said. "You have me confused for someone else. I am not even 60 years old yet," Stelios replied cautiously.
"You are the one that is confused. Just look at the stone. It wouldn't glow like that for just anyone."
Stelios looked down at the stone in his hand, and suddenly found the twisted blade of the figure in his gut.
"You see, old friend,"
the figure growled,
"the great blinded spider requires your presence, and since you didn't come physically after my minion took your family, I will send your spirit to him personally. He doesn't like being ignored, and I will not be a failure in this life."
Stelios could feel the life being drained from him, as well as a second sensation. It was like his consciousness was being ripped from his body towards the sword. Stelios heard the voice again, but it boomed this time.
"Your charge needs you, the hammer."
It boomed. Light began to flicker from the flesh of the giant blacksmith. Stelios reached his hand up, and a massive golden hammer flew to his calloused hands. With everything, he had swung the hammer, and it whistled through the air. It slammed into the figure. There was a crunching sound, and the bandaged figure was sent flying. Brilliant ember light poured out of Stelios and flooded the chamber.
"I wasn't expecting you to be this potent upon exaltation. I shall return to kill those around you until you surrender to me."
The figure hissed and dissolved into a ripple of scattering shadow. Stelios swung again, but his strength was leaving his body. The shadows vanished like smoke in a sharp breeze. Stelios jumped to the ground, wheezing in pain. His body felt like it was on fire. Lightning ran through his nerves. He could feel every pore on his body releasing heat. He screamed in breathless agony before blacking out. The last thing he remembered was the booming voice and a blinding light that washed over him.
"I have chosen you, arrow of heaven. You are now a child of the unconquered sun,"
the voice called out. He awoke, alone. The wound in his gut had scarred over. He went to stand and found his body to be so much lighter than it was before. He stumbled out of the entrance hole he had created. He suddenly remembered that he had left his magnificent golden hammer behind. Instantly, the massive hammer flew into his hand. Guess that answers that," he grunted. He made his way back down the mountain and back to the town. When he entered the forge, Dio snapped at him. "You're late, old man. I was just about to come looking for you. What kept you?" Dio said. "I found who sent the demons. Come on, we're going on a trip. We can't stay here anymore. He will kill everyone in the village," Stelios said. Stelios and Dio began their long trek to Nexus by the way of Nathir. Several months into their journey, a man, about the age of Dio, stood by the side of the road and flagged down their ox cart. "Can I help you, kid?" Stelios growled. "Don't mind him. His bark is worse than his bite," Dio chimed in, noticing the young man's immediate apprehension. He could also feel Stelios' glare in the back of his head. "I'll remember that," Stelios whispered. The young man recovered his nerve. "Mind if I catch a ride with you?" he asked. "To where, mister?" said Dio. Tor Elm, and as far as you're traveling," Tor said. "Nexus?" Dio asked. Tor didn't flinch at the mention and nodded yes. Dio turned to Stelios, eyebrows raised for approval, to which Stelios replied, "Pull your weight. Don't slow us down. Can you fight?" Stelios said in a matter-of-fact tone. Tor perked up, his chest swelling with pride. "I can hold my own," Tor said. "We'll see," Stelios said with a twitching smile. The first night, while making camp, Dio decided to ask him since they'd be traveling together. Tor mentions he's from the north, and he was or is an ice walker of the Great Cat tribe. "I wonder if they still consider me one of their own since I left. 4 years ago, I left to travel and see the world. Plus, I was tired of the cannibals. The Bull of the North, ruler of the bigger band of unified tribes, has simplified the overly complex intertribal politics, strengthened their raids, but disregards all the traditions of the animal masters. These traditions are the things that built the Ice Walkers from the small band of nomadic warriors and hunters to what they are today. I want to depose the bull and have a blend of new and old traditions," Tor said with a glow in his eyes as they reflected the moonlight. Something deep in Dio's subconscious stirred at the ferocity of his gaze, almost as if responding to a brother calling out for help. The hairs on Stelios' neck stood on end, and he felt the solar within him took notice of the lad's declaration. Over the journey, Dio taught Tor survival skills he had picked up over time from the region. Tor told him about northern traditions and growing up as an ice walker. Stelios cooked and barely resisted the urge to knock their heads together when they began to finish each other's sentences. One morning, after packing up camp, Stelios went to make sure the boys were ready for what's ahead and tells them, "I want to see if your combat is up to snuff." "Come at me full bore," Stelios said. Dio immediately climbed up a tree and hid in the canopy. He was no fool, but Tor laughed, again proud of his fighting skills. "There's 2 of us," Tor said. He stopped when he turned to see that Dio had vanished. Stelios proceeded to rip an entire tree limb off a massive oak. He swung up with 2 hands, and a powerful gust of wind made the campfire flicker. "I'll be okay. I'll hold back. Hit me once, you win," Stelios said. Tor stared slack-jawed but still managed to get his guard up in time. Several minutes later, Dio and Tor lay on the ground, tired, bruised, and soundly beaten. Stelios walked by Tor, barely a hair amiss in his beard. "We will try again tomorrow," Stelios said. "I thought you said you would hold back," Tor said between breaths. "He did," Dio gasped in return. "He didn't use his hammer." A few weeks later, Stelios made food while the other 2 strategized how to get a hit in on him. Both young men were sore and licking their wounds after several recent training sessions. "You're too focused on winning. Narrows the vision. You can win but still die," Stelios advised while stirring dinner. Dio hears a voice while he's staring into the fire. It began pulling at his mind.
"Hidden son, a gift awaits you. The path is near."
The next day they came to a fork in the road. As Stelios consults the map, Dio sees a crow perched on a tree at the intersection. The crow stares at him and suddenly flies off to the right. Dio taps Stelios' shoulder, advising him to take that route, and Stelios obliges. Miles down the road, with the evening setting in, Dio sees the crow fly past him from nowhere and turn off into the forest. He suddenly jumps off the cart and chases the crow. Stelios calls for Dio, but after being wholly ignored, he ordered Tor to follow him while he watched the cart. Dio, running full board, can't stop at the sudden drop-off. Dio pops up to his feet as he slides down into a crevasse in the earth. He skids to a halt at the bottom, and Tor calls out, Dio yells back, reassuring Tor that he's fine. As he dusts himself off, he sees a hooded figure with braided tendril-like hair, a large bird skull mask obscuring their face, and a cloak of feathers draped around their shoulders, hiding their form.
Iron Wolf, welcome. I am the quiet nightmare of the sun shadow. I am you, or I was.
They spoke directly into his mind with a nod.
There are gifts for you that once belonged to an incarnation of yours. Use them well,
it says as it raises its feather cloak to reveal treasures. After some time, Dio climbs out of the hole and ran back to Stelios with Tor in tow. Tor is exasperated at the marathon running he had to do. Back at the camp, Stelios is annoyed at Dio's sudden behavior and having to set up camp alone. Stelios looks like he's ready to throttle him as he runs up to him. "Wait until you see this!" "See what, slacker?" Stelios shot back, still annoyed. "It's like a temple where you were attacked," Dio says. "Show me," Stelios demanded, marching off after them. The group slides down and Dio presents a hidden manse tucked away in the earth on a geothermal vent. Dio finds an auriculum power shortbow, a breastplate, and an amulet made of the same material, with a clear stone in the center. Stelios tells Dio how to link with the items. Dio attunes his essence to them. Suddenly, Dio can see in the dark as if it's clear as day because of the hearthstone. No sign of the broken mask, and nothing connects it to the one I found, but it's still a good find all the same. No sign of the broken mask, and nothing that connects it to the one I found, but it's still a good find all the same. Good work, lad, Stelios grumbled. The trio resurfaced, and after getting rested for the night, the group continued on to Nexus. On the final night of travel and training, Stelios brought out his actual weapon, the Grand Gormal. Dio stood and pulled out his gleaming power bowl. Tor stood and put some room between him and Stelios. As he did, Dio notched an arrow. "You've stepped up. I'm stepping up," the towering blacksmith said. Stelios swung the giant hammer with precision, deflecting each arrow that came his way. While he focused on the projectiles, Tor and Dio came at him from both sides, launching a coordinated attack that tested his strength and agility. Dio dropped his bow and charged. With the wind at his back, Stelios dropped his weapon as he braced himself for the onslaught of blows from Tor and Dio. Despite their abilities, he held his ground, knowing that his experience and determination would see him through. As Dio's rapid-fire punches and kicks threatened to overwhelm Stelios, he dug his feet into the ground and pushed back with all his might. The clash of energies sent shockwaves through the air, creating a brief moment of respite for the weary combatants. Stelios and Dio locked in a fierce grapple, their muscles straining against each other. Stelios began to lose his footing on the upturned ground in the clearing. Dio saw an opportunity and used his momentum to throw him off balance, sending them both tumbling to the ground. With Stelios momentarily stunned, Tor seized the chance to strike, launching himself into the air with a powerful kick aimed at the old warrior's face. But Stelios was ready and countered with a burst of energy that sent Tor and Dio crashing to the ground. Despite their exhaustion, Stelios stood tall and declared his young opponents the winners. As they looked on in disbelief, he pointed to a graze on his cheek, a small price to pay for the valuable lesson he had just taught them. "I'm a man of my word. One hit was all you needed. Now we're ready," he stated. Tetsa walked for 2 days under the unforgiving, unconquered sun. Her body wrappings did little to keep her cool or quench her thirst. The sand burned her feet when it fell into her shoes. She was beyond thirsty. Her tongue and lips were cracked, but she kept moving forward. There was no shelter in the smooth dunes of the southern desert. She had wandered too far from her people when the storm hit. She was turned around in it and moved off in one direction when it came to an end. The afternoon of the second day, she tried to move in the evening but quickly realized that she would not be able to see her people's camp because they dug pits for their fires so no light emanated from them. The dune walkers would find you and attack. She began to see things that were not there. An oasis, a yedem, a caravan. Then a small desert mouse popped out of the sand. It squeaked at her, and she stopped. "I have nothing for you, ghost on the wind," she said. It cocked its head and squeaked again. It then took several hops in a different direction than she was heading. She started to walk again, and it squeaked. She looked over, and it was looking at her, then began to hop off in the same direction as before. Tetsa watched it for a moment. It stopped and looked back at her and made a little squeak. "If I walk up to you and you let me touch you, I will follow you," she said. The mouse twitched its whiskers and reared up on its hind legs, paw extended. Tetsa jolted. "Little god?" she muttered. It bowed its head. She walked over and touched its paw. A tingle went up her arm. She was not seeing things. It was real. She stood back and bowed her head. "Take me where you want, little mouse god," she whispered. The mouse god hopped over the dune and Tetsa followed. She walked over several pristine dunes when she saw something flapping in the wind. It looked like a cloth. The mouse god burrowed beneath the sand and popped out again and bared his teeth, sitting back on its hind legs. His tiny paws clawed toward Tetsa. "Dune walkers," she thought. Tetsa saw the piece of cloth again blowing at the top of the next dune. The little god looked at her and then back to the cloth. Tetsa began to walk towards it. She moved slowly and carefully so that her steps made no impact on the sand. She looked for the breathing tubes of the walkers, but saw none. She approached the flapping cloth and saw that one corner had become undone. She caught the flapping corner and saw that the sinew was chewed in half. She looked back at the other dune and saw the little mouse god jumping in the air and then running in a circle. She examined the cloth and realized that it was actually human skin. She peeked under and saw a small baby with white hair and skin asleep on another skin. A child that couldn't yet use a breathing tube was left on the dune. A child that a mouse god had led her to. A woman who could not have a child of her own. A woman that was treated less than equal by her people. The jackal tribe did not look favorably on those who could not increase their ranks. If she brought back a child gifted by the gods, she would be seen as an equal, or possibly more. She picked up the sleeping child and tucked her into her clothing. She stepped to the top of the dune, and when she looked down, she saw the tubes of human bones sticking out of the sand. She froze. Tetsa knew that dune walkers always rested on the sides of dunes facing civilization. She had to retreat down the back of the dune and then to the side. Once clear, she walked in the direction of civilization. She looked back and the mouse god was gone. Tetsa stumbled into the village with a shrieking, sunburnt infant in her arms. The people of the jackal thought she was a hungry ghost of Tetsa returning to haunt them. When she collapsed in the center of the camp, they knew it was Tetsa and approached to help her. The tribe healers tended the child's burnt skin and discovered that her skin was more delicate than theirs. The sun burnt her skin easily, so they wrapped her in strips of cloth like a leper, so that none of her alabaster skin was exposed. They called her Silver because her skin and hair shimmered like silver in the light of the moon. As Silver grew, she learned how to wrap herself in the mornings. She also became familiar with some minor medical knowledge, as the people of the jackal were burdened with many numerous diseases. The tribe took her in as one of their own, and she thrived. She was seen as a boon, a good luck charm, and a seer. She eventually picked up their ways as a beggar, a thief, and a scavenger. Some tried to hate her for her immunity to their diseases, but they soon came around to love her as one of their own. Many that were lost in the sandstorms were found by her. She seems to understand the nature of the desert and how it breathes. Until one night, she stalked a small caravan heading to the lap. They had a large haul of food and supplies that her tribe could use. She watched them for days. She decided to get closer and see what they had stored in the last sled. As she reached it, a surprise sandstorm blew up and blanketed the area. She became disoriented for the first time in her life, and she knew fear of the desert. Figures began to emerge out of the cloud. A faintly familiar clicking and whispering sound surrounded her. Dune walkers. Perhaps even her tribe. They attacked the caravan without mercy. Screams rang out through the cloud. She evaded a few of the dune walkers, but then a large warrior stumbled upon her from a swirling eddy. The bones had not forewarned her of this at all. He smiled as he raised his large bone club and aimed for her head. Suddenly, a jackal sprinted in between them and barked. The surprise caused the giant dune walker to pause and assess the threat. In that moment, Silver slipped under his guard and struck. A dreamlike veil of dark blue and purple light, with a slight silver tint along the edges, exploded from her as she mauled the giant to death with nothing but her bare hands, savage panic, and the cold blessing of Luna. Despite the death of the dune walker, the unnatural sandstorm increased in ferocity, and she stumbled from the corpse, burning with the cold moonlight, and was swallowed into the void of the storm. Several days later, the storm finally died away, and she lifted her head to see a figure standing over her exhausted and fallen form. Saying nothing, he turned and began to walk away. Silver stood and began to follow. He somehow seemed familiar, and she was completely lost in the vast desert dunes. They walked for a day and a night, and they finally came to an oasis, a small structure with plants growing wildly over its surface and around the base poked up above the sand. Water trickled down the sides, and she could not help but run to the vision. The guide followed her. "My name is Garel. I am like you, a shifter," he says. Silver looked up at him as she stopped to drink from the fountain. "What are you talking about?" she said hoarsely. "I was summoned by Luna to find you and train you in the ways," he said. They sheltered in the ruins of the temple for many weeks, while Silver recovered and was instructed in the ways of her people, their history, and how to fight. On a night when the moon was dark as pitch, he brought her to the sept to begin their trials of initiation. The flat rock plateau stood above the sandy floor. They climbed to the top where 12 other figures stood in a circle. They all had the same smell as her and Garel. Each individual looked different, some tall, some short, some women, and some men. They tested her strength, stamina, and determination over the evening, but the real trial set before her was meant to be one of discovery and challenge to power. She was told of a place of power in the domain of a small god. She was not told where, or what, or how, but left to her own devices to continue the trial. Her sense of direction, her skill at divination, and her intuition served her very well. She located the ancient manse hidden in the trackless desert. She crept in past the traps and spent several hours in a contest of wits and wills with the deity within. The small female spirit named Luga was gruff and grumpy and smelled of cinnamon. She wore an amulet with the glittering hearthstone of the manse between her breasts. Luga talked of a time before the fall, and how her only job was to sweep the outside of the temple. She eventually forgot, and it was swallowed up by the sands. Silver began to feel that her challenge was coming to a draw, and the little god refused to share the manse. Silver left and decided to find another spirit to help her out. She eventually found a small cactus god baked from the sun and told him of the manse and of Luga. She spun a yarn of Luga, claiming that all cactus gods are meant to wander the desert homeless. She even lied about Luga, saying how soft and cuddly cactus gods are. The little god, Eurus, was enraged by the tales and decided to confront Luga himself. Silver led him to the manse and waited outside for Ura to teach Luga a lesson. After several hours, the growls, crashes, and the howls stopped, and she entered to find both panting and laying sprawled on the floor of the main room. Silver picked them both up and walked them to the outside of the manse. "I could kill you both and take the manse, or Luga can agree to share the manse with the both of us. I will be taking the hearthstone for defeating you with my guile and cunning intelligence of the scavenger," Silver said. Luga looked at them both and agreed. Eurus also nodded in agreement. As she headed back to the sept, striding confidently through the comforting blackness of the night beneath Luna's darkened face, she had more than survived. She wrestled control of and attuned to her hidden well of power. Her caste was fixed in the absence of the moon by the Council of Shifters. When the sept concluded, she and her mentor walked side by side on the slow journey back to her adopted family. She was now Silver Shadow to outsiders, sister to her tribe. She continued to wander with her jackal tribe. Her wraps now obscured her lunar tattoos as well as her light-sensitive skin. Gorell showed up occasionally and they communed, hunted and taught, and learned for a time before he continued on his journeys. The last time, however, he came back with concern. Something was building like the pressure of fire beneath the rocky skin of the earth, and he was afraid that the impending explosion would be disastrous, and not just to the soft city dwellers, to everything. Gorell left after delivering his warning. He wandered off to seek his own answers. Silver Shadow cast the bones, and they agreed with her intuition. She began to follow the threads of fate toward the convergence of so many paths. Nexus.